You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today, I am joined by property industry veteran and co-founder of ProperPR, Russell Quirk. I'm just going to have to mute the microphone, Russell, so that the boos die down.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of used to that really being the pantomime villain of the property industry, but I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit more detail.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Fresh from a brush with BA,
yes,
a trip to America.
Yeah, that was fun, or not. Well, the trip to America was great, and I went on a kind of busman's holiday around Florida looking at US realtors and brokers and how they do things. So I think there's a lot for UK estate agents to learn from the US in terms of particularly around lead generation and relationships with clients and customer service, and in a quest actually to make the industry better, but also to charge higher fees, frankly. But yes, no, I had the fortune to fly American Airlines on the way there, which was great. Kind of checked in at Heathrow, and I was in the lounge within about 9 minutes. It was incredible. But on the way back, wow, what a contrast. British Airways, they used to be the world's favourite airline, didn't they? They're certainly not now, not mine, or many others that I've seen on social media as a consequence of me slating them for their poor service, and then everybody else piling in and saying they'd had a similar experience. And I guess, look, maybe this is a segue, right? So, the likes of British Airways that are falling on their swords because of bad customer service, and here I am on a podcast talking about conveyancers. There's no link there at all, David, is there?
Well, we thought this might be controversial. We'll sort of launch right into it, and we're going to chat a little bit about estate agents and conveyancers. Your piece pre-Christmas in Property Industry Eye drew a fair amount of comment from around the industry, it's fair to say, in which there was some controversial comments about conveyancers. But the fundamental point is that the way that we transact property is broken. What do you sort of see as being kind of the major challenges in the industry at the moment?
So look, when I talk about it being broken, I mean, I don't think there's any conveyancer with a brain cell, surely, that doesn't agree that the system needs improvement. I mean, let's start there, right, at kind of ground zero. I can be spiky and poke fun and be sarcastic about the conveyancing sector because I think it is a joke generally in terms of how long it takes and its clunkiness, should we say, and the fact that it's incredibly draconian. But although I've been slated for daring to raise the spectre of improvement in the conveyancing space, surely there isn't a conveyancer that will listen to this and say, nah, it's all great. It's all fine. Getting from offer to exchange in 6 months, using Royal Mail to convey documentation still, some I dare venture, some might even still be using quill pens and pots of ink, David. But so look, let's start there from the premise that this thing needs to be improved. So look, I'm not a conveyancer, I'm not a lawyer. But my research over the years tells me that conveyancing is a thing that was created by Henry VIII so that he could dissolve the monasteries. My contention is it hasn't moved forward at all since the 16th century. So the broken element is the time it takes, the fact then that provides huge uncertainty, stress and pressure on buyers, sellers, agents, and of course conveyancers. The fact that it is this kind of piecemeal puzzle that has to be put together with multiple pieces which seem to increase in terms of those pieces, milestones and so on. But the lunacy is that it's consecutive. Now, the fact that, I've talked to conveyancers about this, right? And I'm not a conveyancer, right? So I've never conveyed a property, but I have been part of, as an agent and a house builder and a buyer and a seller of property. I've been involved in thousands of transactions, thousands, right? So I've got some qualification in terms of life experience to say what I'm saying, I think. So I think the issue is that it's a complicated process with loads of moving parts, but conveyancers have made no effort for decades to try and circumvent or streamline. And instead, whenever I speak to smart conveyancers about how to short circuit the system, how to provide more certainty, there's resistance, and there's always resistance. And what I find incredible is that I talk to conveyancers about, well, do you really need a local authority search? And the answer is, well, yeah, that's kind of just the way it is. Well, my suggestion is that we start thinking differently. So instead of thinking, well, the problem is the local authority search because I don't do anything until that's back and that takes 3 months. So there you go, Russell, that's 3 months of it, isn't it? Think of it differently. Why don't we circumvent the local authority search? Why don't we lobby lenders to provide the absence of the local authority search in favour of something like shock horror title insurance, which is what is used in the United States and has been for decades and decades and decades. And guess what? The United States property industry has not collapsed as a consequence of using title insurance. So, it must be able to be used. And let's not forget that apart from, Papua New Guinea, we are the only country in the world that uses the same archaic, draconian, slow and uncertain conveyancing process that we do. So, look, I have what I think are a load of answers. And I think what I've just done in the last, whatever that is, 6 or 7 minutes of my little monologue there, David, I've just touched the surface of think differently, do stuff in parallel. So, if we still have to use local authority searches, well, let's have funds in place at the beginning and tell buyers and sellers, and whether it's, you do this on behalf of the buyer in terms of the local authority search, or we do it like the old home information packs started to dictate. We get the seller to actually put the local authority search in place. Whatever we do, let's do it all at the same time. And yes, look, I can hear shouts from people saying, yes, but we need upfront information and estate agents should be responsible for that. I accept that. I accept that there needs to be an element of that. If it were up to me, I would reinvigorate home information packs. And again, look, estate agents, if they're listening to this, will be shouting at their devices saying, no, they were a disaster. Why were home information packs a disaster? Because there was nothing in the bloody things. They were 500 quid for an empty vessel. There was an index. There was no replies to inquiries, no contract, no survey, no standard replies to inquiries. So look, there's a whole bunch of things that we need to do to circumvent this. But frankly, I don't think the conveyancing sector are bothered. I think they're fine with the historic, broken, draconian way of doing things. I think they've accepted it, and there's no wish on the part of the industry to try and solve this huge problem that exists for consumers, for agents, and for them. Can you imagine if we could get a deal through to contract in 10 days? What do we think the fall through rate would be? Instead of 35%, which then affects everybody, it might be 3 or 4% or 5%. That would save conveyancers, agents, and so on rather a lot of time, trouble, and money, I think.
You've kind of touched on the fact that there's this disconnect between agents and conveyancers, and quite frankly, there is. As you say, there'll be lots of people listening to this who will be throwing things at their devices from either side of the fence. How does that disconnect contribute to the issues that we see?
So the conveyancers and agents do see each other as the enemy, don't they?
And wrongly, isn't it?
Completely wrongly, because we're all pushing in the same direction to the same goal. But of course, the consequence of this ridiculously drawn out and uncertain process is that it raises pressure. And it certainly raises pressure on the agent, because the agent generally is getting paid only on success. So, when a deal that's worth £20,000 in commission is teetering on the edge of collapse because it's taken 8 months, and because there are all these tiny little issues that haven't been ironed out at the beginning, they've kind of come to fruition at the end of the process. You can understand why agents get very tetchy. Conveyancers, of course, will argue, yeah, but if we didn't have agents ringing us 4 times a day about this particular case or that particular case, then we'd have more time to do our jobs. Well, they're all part of the same problem, aren't they? That because it's draconian and drawn out and uncertain, means that people kind of weigh in terms of agents harassing conveyancers getting miffed, and the whole thing kind of ends up in this hideous kind of vicarious circle. So I think that the relationship between conveyancers and estate agents is not a good one. And look, dare I venture that there is a solution to that, apart from making the process better, and whether that's upfront information, whether it's digitizing, whether it's reservation agreements, whether it's deposits, all this stuff that I've been talking about with Beth Rudolph and others on the home buying and selling group, which by the way, in itself is 3 years in, and we still don't have anything like a solution. So therein lies another problem. Look, yeah, I think that the issues are there to be solved. We just have to have the right mindset. But if we don't, the solution, and I'm slightly hesitating saying this given your audience, the solution is that estate agents will and should take over the conveyancing process. Yeah. Now, again, the shouts from the audience will be, yeah, but you need conveyancers because we're the qualified ones and so on. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, if I decided to tomorrow, I can pick out a qualified conveyancer or a solicitor, stick them in my business in an office with a locked door, apparently, because that's what the rules say, there has to be a separation, and I'll just do it ourselves. And that way I can make sure that the urgency and the culture that I think is required to get deals through quickly in a more certain way happens because of the very nature of the fact that process then becomes part of my estate agency business. And I understand that there can't be an influence from, a non-conveyancer over the conveyancing process. I get all that. But the reality is, if an estate agent was employing a conveyancer, in the same way as in Scotland, the process is very aligned between the agent and the lawyer. It's the lawyer really that is the agent, effectively. In the US, I stood in Fort Lauderdale last week with an operating principal of a market centre there, a Keller Williams market centre owner. And I said, look, talk me through the process. What happens when there's a deal done? And they said, well, we write the contract, we put in place the title insurance, and often the agent owns the title insurance company because there's huge profit in it. Most states don't even have a lawyer. So in Florida, you don't need an attorney. Some states you do, and all they do is hire an attorney. Basically, it's a name above the door who signs the thing off. But the thing is put together and remains in-house so that therefore there is consistency. So, I think that could happen, maybe that should happen, where the whole process is taken under the wing of the agent. Because let's be honest, look at it from the consumer's point of view, which we must always do. The consumer doesn't care about estate agents versus conveyancers. They don't even know what a conveyancer is half the time. They call their conveyancer a solicitor. The agent's the one that they go to all the time for feedback and for updates because they can rarely get hold of their conveyancer or solicitor, frankly. So why not say to the consumer, well, look, I'll list your house for sale. I will market it, sell it. I will then undertake the process to get you through to legal completion. That terminology, without having to differentiate between agent and conveyancer and that the kind of associated but separate processes, the consumer won't give a monkeys. In fact, if I sell it that way, the consumer says, all right, so I'll deal with you all the way from the valuation in my lounge, all the way through to handing over the keys to the buyer. Oh, that's fantastic. That's much better than, who are you going to introduce me to? Oh, I'm going to introduce you to Stuart Forsdyke at PCS. He's a great guy. Oh, right. Okay. Well, now I've got to get to know him, and different relationship. And now there's 2 of you, and then he's got an assistant. So now there's 3 of you. You see what I mean? So packaging it up into something that's more cohesive and more contained as a proposition and as a process, you're not going to get any resistance from the consumer, David.
I'm not quite sure where to go from there, Russell.
You're loving this, David, aren't you? This is good. This is good stuff, isn't it? This is, and look, from the heart, I truly believe what I'm saying here, that, look, all I'm trying to do is help find a solution. The status quo is not an option. We cannot end up in a position where, it used to take 3 months to get a deal through. Now it's taking 4, 5, 6 months, and that's kind of okay. It isn't. It just isn't okay. It's not okay for the agent, the conveyancer, or the consumer. It's not okay for anybody. And look, frankly, maybe if it was a better process and it was more certain, and people felt better about it, rather than moving home still being one of the top three things that people, dread in terms of pressure and stress, the thing that they don't want to repeat again. Maybe actually if it was better, shock horror, here's another thing, maybe conveyancers could charge more, rather than having painted themselves into this little corner where they're charging £300 or £400 for what is undoubtedly a service that's worth a couple of £1,000s. They're legal professionals, they're experts. They have huge responsibility in terms of conveying good title. How on earth and why on earth should a conveyancer be doing that for £400? It's nuts. I can hear a little ripple of applause there, David.
There is. You're absolutely right. To what extent do you see the upfront information and the announcement by the National Trading Standards and Lettings team? I can never remember exactly that terminology. To what extent do you sort of see that is going to improve the process?
It has to, and it makes utter sense that information is contained up front, and actually not just so that it's all in one place at the beginning, so it makes things quicker, but actually so that the buyer can actually see that information for themselves. If they could see replies to inquiries, a contract, covenants, and surveys at the beginning, it would better inform, and therefore there would be better quality deals done, less likelihood of deals falling through, less likelihood of a chip on exchange, which obviously happens. I think it's absolutely vital. I do think that what we don't want is that someone lists a property for sale and then it takes 5 weeks before it can be marketed because whoever, the conveyancer or the seller or the agent, has to run around finding little bits of paper. It needs to be digitized. So, this stuff needs to be put in a digital form so that it is instantly accessible. I've never been able to understand with local authority searches why the search just can't be live. If indeed, as I said previously, you need to use a search at all, but surely it should be not beyond the realms of technology that a company or local authorities or the local government association can find their way to having that information live, like the land registry is. Land registry don't have to go off and double check to see if something's registered to Mr. and Mrs. J. Smith. It's just registered, and as soon as it changes, and therefore there's an element of it being live. So yeah, look, all of that stuff needs to be up front. It needs to be accessible though, and all in one place. And look, that I think solves a lot of the problems. But then I also think the idiosyncrasies of the conveyancing process, all the silly little things, the just discovered a TPO, just discovered there's a covenant, or whatever the issue might be that gets thrown up frequently as a kind of an ad hoc out there type of issue. We need to use title insurance more. I know we use indemnities, but we need to use title insurance more on the basis that otherwise these transactions, just even with upfront information, I think can still be subject to huge obstacles down the line, particularly if you've got a particularly pedantic conveyancer, frankly.
In the course of the discussion, we've talked about local authorities, we've talked about conveyancers, estate agents, lenders, surveyors, and each of those sort of working parts of the process. And they all have a responsibility to play in improving it. Whose responsibility do you see that it is to drive these solutions forward? And we're beholden to a process that's laid down in law. So to what extent does government have a role to play in this?
Government has a huge role to play in it because a lot of this will need to be legislated for. Most certainly. The problem is governments have other things on their minds, it seems, like coronavirus, pandemic sweeping the world, and now a war in Europe. So there's always going to be things that take precedence. In terms of primary legislation, the government are only ever able to get about 20 to 25 pieces of legislation through each parliament. It seems. I mean, it's archaic, but they do need to change legislation to ensure that things can be done in a more timely way. So, for instance, reservation agreements, deposits, etc., getting us to a point where the exchange of contracts happens at the beginning of the process, not the end of the process, that has to be driven by legislation. In terms of your question, whose responsibility is this? The as it is now, it keeps changing, doesn't it? What was the MHCLG and now the Department for Levelling Up and Michael Gove's ambitions. I think that's the name of the department. That department, is. Don't know. Look, it's going to be too busy, isn't it? It's going to be too busy with other things. And they have said very clearly as a department that because they are under-resourced and because this isn't something that is their priority. In other words, it's not a vote winner. I think that's the key. It's not a vote winner. Then therefore it's up to the industry itself, and I think that means the conveyancing industry, to come up with a package of solutions that they can then go to government with, and the government can kind of rubber stamp. So I think the responsibility is on the conveyancing sector to suggest a properly packaged set of solutions to government for them to rubber stamp. The problem there is, again, I don't think the conveyancing sector is minded to want to do that. My experience of the home buying and selling group is that it's massive and unwieldy. It was great at the beginning when there were 5 or 6 of us. Now there's about 47 members of that group. It takes an hour and a half to do introductions. It's ludicrous. And lo and behold, guess what? Now it's become disparate and protracted in terms of its arguments within that group. So that's kind of not worked. It would be nice if the government could wave a magic wand and say, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to revert to the US system, or we're going to revert to the Scottish system. I just don't think that's going to happen. So it takes the responsibility, therefore, falls on the conveyancing industry, or it will be for the estate agency industry. As I've said, maybe a wise, clever, innovative estate agent will come up with a solution, which, if that happens, will cut out the conveyancing industry to a great extent. Or, as I was talking to a friend of mine in prop tech earlier, the hope, I think, from some quarters is that this becomes a technology solution, but it can't just be a technology solution. Tech, I think, has a massive part to play here in terms of digitization of information, as we've said. But, digitization isn't going to change attitudes. It's not going to make conveyancers do stuff, in parallel rather than consecutively. It's not going to change the fundamental culture. And actually, look, conveyancers are probably worse than estate agents when it comes to adopting technology anyway. So you could put the technology into place. Would it be adopted by, the average single office conveyancer or solicitor? I doubt it very much. So look, it's a conundrum, isn't it? It's a conundrum. And look, I'm not here to say I've got all the answers. I've got the magic wand. But look, something will happen. Maybe a startup with some backing, with an element of technology, and with someone involved that is determined to solve the problem of conveyancing, stroke relationships with the estate agent, stroke protracted nature of the process, uncertainty, and so on. I think it will be solved, but I don't see it happening from inside the conveyancing industry. There's certainly no will or ambition or any sign that I see that even the so-called innovators, the simplifiers of this world or whatever, notwithstanding their technology problems, there's just no motivation really to change the process. I think there's motivation to try and change elements of the process, but not the process itself.
I'd heard 2 definitions a little while ago. One was digitization, and one was digitalization.
Yeah.
And they're 2 completely different concepts. I don't know whether you know this. I didn't know this. Digitization is the process by which you take a paper process and you digitize it. Digitalization is looking at that process and saying, actually, we need to start again. You rip up everything that you did, and you start from a point whereby if we did this again today, we'd, this is how we do it. And I think, the whole process of moving home, and why I asked the question about the role of government, we are in a situation where the law is what it is. As I say, we're sort of beholden to the process as it stands at the moment. But I'm very interested in your thoughts on ultimately whose responsibility it is, because I don't think any one of those organisations is going to enact change on its own.
No, my short answer is it's up to the conveyancing sector to reinvent itself. And whether it's digitisation or digitalisation, it's innovation for the benefit of the consumer and the sectors around the process. It's up to the conveyancing sector. But my experience of innovation and technology is that innovation rarely comes from inside. So you won't get a 55-year-old conveyancer sitting in a 100-year-old solicitor firm suddenly wake up one morning and say, eureka, I've solved it. It'll come from an innovative tech-driven law graduate, or it'll come from somewhere else, or it will come from abroad. Because actually what will happen is, if I was sitting in the US thinking, well, in the US we get under contract within 10 days, it's a really nice simple process, there's no wastage, why can't it be like that in the UK? You'll get a process from another territory kind of adapted, I think, to solve the UK's problems. That's probably likely. And yes, look, an element of culture, an element of process, an element of technology, but actually what it needs is will. It needs motivation. And look, on the basis this is a big problem to solve, million transactions a year, 30 to 35% fall through rate, conveyancers not being paid enough, it's big industry, big rewards, big problem to solve. Someone will solve it.
I think on that happy note, I think we'll probably sort of finish. It's been a delight to talk with you, Russell. I won't lie, I am worried about the response to this podcast. But I think, in all fairness and all joking aside, this is a conversation that needs to happen. We know that conveyancing is a sector that needs to innovate, that it almost needs to reinvent itself. I think there's a lot of players in this space that acknowledge that as well, in fairness.
It is about debate. It is about improvement. As I say, the kind of the place that the industries, because they are so interconnected, the place where the industries are at in terms of lethargy and uncertainty, I just don't think it's something that's sustainable. It's just not on. It's not on for the consumer, And look, I'm still quite involved in estate agency businesses here and there, and I genuinely see and hear the woes of those consumers. First-time buyers that are bewildered, elderly people that wanted to move in March and it looks like it's not going to happen till June. People let down at the last minute, gazundering. That's just not right, is it? Those things are just not right. And, forget the commerciality of this, forget who's right and who's wrong. Honestly, tell me, is there a conveyancer listening to this now that can honestly say the conveyancing process as a whole, not conveyancers, not individuals, the conveyancing, let's call it the home moving process, just to be diplomatic. Is it okay? Honestly, could it not be improved? Seriously?
Thank you very much indeed for joining the podcast. It's been fantastic to speak with you.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.
And thank you very much indeed to everybody for listening. We'll be back very soon with another podcast from Today's Conveyancer. Thanks all.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.